My name is Leeson. I'm a former derivatives trader. My reckless trading unfortunately resulted in the collapse of a 233-year-old merchant bank with losses of $1.2 billion. And this is how crime works. I had the biggest position. I needed the most money, the most margin. I was reporting the biggest profits. I was very much the ascending star within the organisation for a period of time, but then had a very spectacular fall from grace. I had the opportunity to move to Singapore in 1992. In Singapore, I ran the whole operation for Barings. It was very much a new business. Barings has a historic reputation amongst banking in the UK. It was 233 years old. It was one of the oldest merchant banks, if not the oldest. All of the transactions that Barings would have made during that period were with other financial institutions. So big fund managers, other banks. It wasn't a bank where you would have normal people having accounts, making investments. All your trades for the day, those have all got account numbers on them. The 5/8 account is the infamous account where I kept any losses. The reason behind the 5/8 account is 8 is a lucky number in Chinese folklore. If there were any errors, those errors would be captured in Singapore and then reported back to the UK. So the type of errors would be, you've got 2,000 people or 1,500 people in a trading pit. So it's very easy to think you've got one person's eye line, but you've actually got the person behind you, behind that person's eye line as well. So they might think you've traded with them. There might be price discrepancies. So all of those stuff has to be reconciled during the course of the day, and that's what would go into an error account. So that's where the 5/8 account was born. That was sent back to London, and after a period of time London said they didn't want to see all of the detail, so it was kept in Singapore. So it's on one of those occasions, late at night, 4 o'clock in the morning, one of the girls who worked on the trading floor, you could see that she'd passed the trade incorrectly. The very next morning I go in to see Simon Jones, who was the head of the operations department in Singapore, sit down, tell him that we have an error, ask me to quantify it. I said about £10,000, that's where it was. And he asked me to refer it back to Andrew Bayliss, he was the head of the trading area, and would have understood it very, very quickly. So, it's 8 o'clock in the morning in Singapore, that's probably 2 o'clock in the morning UK time, so I'm not going to be able to get hold of Andrew Bayliss. So then I'm in this massive dilemma. Do I wait for the market, on the market open, do I cut that immediately, which is the way that you are supposed to follow through on this process, or do I take a chance and see if the market gets back to the level that the position is, and then I don't even have to tell Andrew Bayliss. And I've got 4 or 5 hours to run that position and see what happens. And unfortunately what I chose to do is the latter. Throughout the time that I worked at Barings, not at Morgan Stanley and definitely not at Coutts, but throughout the time I was at Barings, I would see people put trades into error accounts all of the time. So when it came to my turn to see if I wanted to put something in an error account and hold it for a period of time, it was far too easy because I'd seen so many people do it in the past and not be reprimanded, not get caught. And that's the first really bad mistake that I made in my business career. And it's, unfortunately over time, it just grew and grew and grew. To look at the 5/8 account chronologically, there's a year-end audit in September of 1992. The loss at that stage is up to $5 million. Deloitte's are coming in to do the audit. There is a $5 million discrepancy in the year-end accounts. Deloitte's put that down to a foreign exchange discrepancy, and somehow I managed to survive for a little bit longer. By May of 1993, the loss is $20 million. And then in May of 1993, we have the most perfect expiry in the options market. The options expire at the most perfect level. I make all of the 20 million back, and I have a £250,000 profit that I need to get rid of, which is a lot easier to do. I transfer it to somebody's trading book in Tokyo and genuinely go home that weekend thinking, that's great, I can start again now. I'm young throughout this process. I was 25 when I moved to Singapore. You know, not a great deal of management expertise. The people that worked for me were my friends. They were never admonished. They were never reprimanded. So on the Monday morning, when somebody makes a mistake again, it goes back in the 5/8 account. You know, as difficult as the previous 7, 8, 9 months have been, I very stupidly put the trade back into the 5/8 account. You know, one of the reasons is that I've corrected it once. I probably think I can do it again. And that's when it started to blow up. You know, the markets are moving aggressively lower. I'm the wrong side of the market, so these positions are getting bigger. I'm doubling down. I think by the end of 1994, I probably had about $600 million from London, from the Treasury Department in London. So the loss has to be fairly close to that number. Everything's done with hand signals. It's very noisy, it's very boisterous. Before I arrived in Singapore, there was only one main product, which was the euro dollar, which is also traded in Chicago. But Singapore was filling a gap, if you liked, between the US, Europe and the different time locations. So the Nikkei 225 had only really kicked off in the last year or so in Singapore. And so it meant that in Singapore you went from trading 2,000 contracts a day to trading 20,000 contracts. And that meant that the Singapore International, well, I think everybody wasn't ready for it. The rule of thumb is that it takes about 30 minutes to match a trade. You and I trade, we both put in a little trade ticket, a docket. One's a buy, one's a sell. You put those into the system on the trading floor, the CIMEX system, and hopefully those trades match. So they need to match as to quantity and to price and month. And if it doesn't match, then you have to resolve that issue as quickly as possible. Because the settlement systems weren't able to deal with it on the floor at the time because of this massive influx of volume, it was taking 14, 15 hours to match the trade. So it was, you know, and that means you've got exposure for that period of time. And you've got all of these tickets that are flying around, getting lost, and all sorts of stuff going on. So that was the backlog that was being created during that period. If you go back to Barings, back at the time of the collapse in 1995, we'd only just taken on an internal audit team, as ridiculous as that sounds. We had a risk manager, we had one risk manager. So if you go into Citibank or somewhere now, there would be 3,000, 5,000 people working in risk management. There would be a similar number working in compliance. But at Barings at the time, the risk manager, the compliance officer were the same person. So you would find people double jobbing. When I was trading and people that I knew would have been trading back in the 90s, we'd trade and then we'd tell people that it had been done, whereas now it's part of the process. Singapore is it's quite a controlled environment. The Porsches, the penthouses, the yachts wasn't the life that I was living. I have to be honest, I really didn't see that. It was much more family orientated. You'd go out as you would in any walk of life, and you'd enjoy yourself at the weekends. You'd go to concerts and the like. I think Singapore is a country that doesn't have a drug culture. The penalties are really severe, so you didn't encounter anything like that. And it has strict rules, about outraging female modesty and stuff like that. So there are things that you can get away with a little bit, but they're not the sensational stuff that you might see on Wolf of Wall Street or one of those type of movies. Singapore wasn't that country. When I moved to Singapore, I took a pay cut because it was the opportunity I wanted more than anything else. And so I think my salary probably was £50,000 at the time. That would have been in 1992. Obviously, the salary has increased quite significantly over that period. But Barings were renowned for paying big bonuses. It was, I think my smallest bonus at Barings was a year's salary. And that would have been fairly standard. I think what bonuses do is they create a lot of short-termism. So people are trying to hit numbers so that their bonus gets paid, and you can see that definitely happens. If you look back at some of the reporting that I was doing during that period, people were focused obviously on the profit. I think as long as it reflected a profit, there wasn't enough investigation that went into it. The problem was that I was the outlier on pretty much every metric you can imagine. I had the biggest position, and all of that should have attracted more attention, but unfortunately it didn't, because the focus was on the money that was being made, and if you were reporting a profit, it tended not to be investigated that much. You know, there were lots of people getting 7-figure bonuses in the senior management roles at that time, and some people getting even more than that. Barings was a charitable trust. Why was it a charitable trust? If you're a charitable trust, you can pay bigger bonuses than you can in a corporate entity at that particular time. You know, I know I get a lot of flack because it was a charitable trust and it did do a lot of good, but it was also a vehicle that enabled Barings to pay huge bonuses to their staff. I certainly didn't confide in anybody during that period, but there were a couple of other episodes in Singapore or in Asia at that time. There was a guy who worked for Barings in Hong Kong who was sacked for misrepresenting the profit on his trades. The problem for me was that every time I stepped over the mark, there was never any pushback. I was always pushing further and further. It was very Jekyll and Hyde during that time. I knew what the reality was in terms of the trades. As much as I didn't want to look at the trades and look at the statements and see the number in front of me, because it was, you know, it was a mix of frightening, embarrassing, and a number of other emotions as well. You couldn't distance yourself completely from it, so you knew roughly what it was. But then you had to go out onto the trading floor and appear confident and get involved, and still you're trying to manipulate the situation so that you can get the market to go back up. And you know, everybody thought that every time they traded with me they lost money, and they probably did, because I was manipulating the markets in both locations. But ultimately, as the market collapsed, I was the one that lost far more money than anybody else. So there's there is always that facade. You then go home, you've got a domestic situation where your wife thinks that everything's okay, she's got a great lifestyle, she's enjoying herself in Singapore, and you've got to maintain that as well. So you're balancing all of these, but it's all a tissue of lies. You know, underneath it all, you know, there's no stability. It has the potential to crash down at any particular point. The parallels that people draw with gambling, I think anybody who works in the investment or financial markets always shies away from the association, but there are parallels, right? The doubling down is one of those. Or the other parallel that you can draw is that a lot of people, when they're gambling, they start to chase their losses, and so there was a lot of chasing in this situation as well. And I'm sure if you speak to any bookmaker, they make most of their money from people that chase their losses. Barings was a very small bank, so a treasury department that would look after the funding and where capital was deployed. So I would send emails on a regular basis asking Treasury for more money. Treasury was in London, and they would send that money over, and there would be an intercompany balance between the two parts of the organisation. I knew that they were having difficulty getting the funding to me, that it was getting more and more difficult over this period. The capital base of the bank was only £250 million. Right, so it was a small bank, but yet they'd sent me £650 million. So they were borrowing the money. They were borrowing it from Barclays, they were borrowing it from Citibank, and they were feeding me in Singapore to continue going with the process. And then at the beginning of 1995, it became even more difficult for them. Barclays and Citibank refused to lend them any more money. Obviously, they'd bypassed some sort of credit limit. They went to the stock market and they issued a bond for £100 million that also found its way out to me in Singapore. So from a governance perspective and looking at things holistically, you know, they weren't testing or challenging what was going on at the time. You've got a small bank, so £250 million worth of capital. The legal limit you can lend to a subsidiary is 20% of the bank's capital. So that's 50 million. I'm 13 times in breach of that limit, you know, because I have £650 million with me in Singapore that are funding my illegal positions. And it's more than 2.5 times the capital base of the bank as well. So these are, when you look back and you look at the sort of numbers, it's outlandish that it was allowed to get to that sort of level. You have to report this to the regulators. The regulator at the time was the Bank of England. So the Bank of England would get a report every single day that would detail how much money was being lent to Singapore. And they could see that they were exceeding the legal limit. But the Board of Banking Supervision, which met after the collapse of Barings, asked the Bank of England what they were doing, and the person who worked in that role, who was looking at the breaches, and this is actually in the report, it says that it was too far down in his in tray and he hadn't got around to it yet. So it's like, when you look back at Barings, it's a systemic breakdown in the system that includes regulators, auditors, and so many different people who really weren't doing their jobs. Me very much included. My incompetence and negligence is very much at the forefront of everything that went on, and there's no excuse for that. But I accept full responsibility and accountability. But there were hundreds of people that should have been a bit more aware of what was going on. Obviously, it's a bit of a confidence trick in terms of if they would ask me questions, I'd be very confident about my responses, even if it was complete and utter rubbish. I'll give you an example, right? So we had a squawk box in Singapore where I would pass orders to Osaka, which is where the Nikkei 225 orders would be transacted in Japan. So one day I got a phone call from Andrew Bayliss, and he was concerned because my position limit was 250 lots of the Nikkei 225, and he could see trades that were massively in breach of that. So a trade for 5,000 contracts, a trade for 10,000 contracts, and many of those on the same day. So clearly in breach of the position that I was allowed to hold, and many times in breach. So I told Andrew that what he was actually seeing was that the settlement system was grouping together trades at the same price, which is complete and utter rubbish. You couldn't trade that sort of volume at that particular price. But if he'd really understood the business, he wouldn't have been asking me. He would have phoned Osaka and said, how did you receive the order? And that would have thrown everything out. Everything would have been exposed at that point, because the orders would have been buy 5,000 at the market, buy 10,000 at the market, and fairly rapid order as well. But because he didn't understand how the business fitted together, he didn't go that far. So there was a great deal of knowledge. There's a lot of people who went to really good schools, really good universities, but however much knowledge you have, if you don't understand the business, you can't challenge it. That allowed me to somehow wiggle through some of those controls. So you go from thinking I'm not going to get exposed this minute because they haven't done it yet. I've got a day, or I've got 2 days. And then you think in terms of weeks. And then you've got maybe, after a period of time, you think I've got a month to correct the situation. And still they're not asking the right questions. So you get a little bit more confident. The balance sheet, the financial accountant in Singapore would only pick it up on the last day of the month. So that's the only day that the 5/8 account had to be zero. So I'd sell a load of options, I'd receive the premium, that would take the account balance line down to zero. And as long as I was getting margin from London, I was able to continue this ad infinitum, or until the bank ran out of money, which unfortunately is the result in this case. So the pressure starts to build through 1994. There's lots of things that are happening on the success side of it. You're winning awards on the Singapore International Monetary Exchange for the highest customer volume. 90% of that is for my illegal 5/8 account. So, it's a success. It's something that's feted by everybody within the organisation. But again, the reality. This award is for your 5/8 account, for the illegal trading account. And again, how do people accept that we're doing this volume of trading, or they look at the bona fide level of trading that they're seeing reported and they're winning an award? It just doesn't correlate. But yet the management would come from London or Tokyo to help me receive those awards. There'd be a party. They hired out Grand Central Station, New York, to have a party after the conference. And the only person who didn't attend was me, because I was in the bar downstairs getting drunk. It was probably, that was probably above the limit of what I was able to continue balancing, juggling at that particular point. There was all of these people having a conference about the money that we were making in Singapore. At the beginning of 1995, Ron Baker is talking to me about what my bonus is going to be. Is £500,000 enough? And they're conversations you don't want to have, and you know that the pressure is starting to build. Can't bring myself to enunciate what's happened over this previous period and put my hand up and be honest about what's going on. I'm in Ireland at the end of 1994, and on the very last day of the month, one of the girls in the office, she phoned me up and she said, we haven't done anything with the 5/8 account. And so I said, just pass a one-sided journal entry, credit the account, just buying a bit more time. But I didn't expect to go back to Singapore, but I still can't put my hand up, my wife, my family, and tell them what's going on. So I stepped foot on the plane back to Singapore. There's an earthquake in Kobe, the markets start to fall even quicker, which means that position is increasing more dynamically. And the loss is, £650 million, so probably $840 million at that particular point. I've made this one-sided journal entry, so the balance sheet doesn't agree, so I've got to come up with an excuse, and that's what becomes known as the SLK receivable, where I'm trading an OTC option, which I have no authority to do. It's for 7 billion yen, so it's not a small OTC transaction, and then I have to manufacture an audit confirmation to prove that as well. An OTC transaction is an over-the-counter transaction, so it doesn't happen on the exchange floor. Deloitte's wanted an audit confirmation about the amount of money, which obviously I couldn't provide, but what they did do is they asked me to seek out the audit reconciliation, which isn't something that would happen these days. So I went home, or I may have done it from my desk in Singapore, but the audit confirmation needed a signature from somebody at Spear Leeds Kellogg. So I managed to get a signature from somewhere and really just pasted it onto the document where it was required. Went home to my apartment in Angula Park in Singapore and faxed it to the auditors. So when the auditors received it, on the top of the piece of paper it says, from Nick and Lisa. So you can see that it's not come from Spear Leeds Kellogg. There's only one inscription on the piece of paper, and it's from my house. And yet they still accepted that and didn't ask any more questions. So the lack of oversight throughout the whole story is quite astounding. If you look at Auditing 101, that audit confirmation would break every rule in that. And I'm just trying to keep going through this process. On the 23rd of February 1995, somebody came to me with a reconciliation of the 5/8 account. Right? A reconciliation should be done every single day. At Morgan Stanley, I used to do the reconciliations myself. Nobody did those reconciliations for a 2.5, 3 year period. But in February, at the beginning of February 1995, London, obviously concerned about the amount of money that we had in Singapore, the lack of the amount of reporting that was coming back from my office in Singapore as well. They sent a settlements person, Tony Railton, out to Singapore to look at what we were doing. But still, it took him 20 days to do a reconciliation. And when he did that reconciliation, it's black and white, right? We only have two accounts, London and Tokyo. You add them together, you compare it to the Singapore International Monetary Exchange, and there's a huge discrepancy. And so when he confronts you with it in black and white, there's no excuse, there's no explanation, right? There's nothing that's going to wash at that particular point. So you make your excuses, you leave the office, and you go back to home, you pack a bag, and you get out of Singapore. And you're really not aware of quite how disastrous or calamitous the effect of your actions is going to be. I didn't know that I had twice or 2.5 times the capital base of the bank with me in Singapore, but you want to get out and then just see what happens and then work out what your next move is from there. So it's fight or flight. I never expected the bank to collapse. Yes, I knew there was going to be a considerable loss, but the bank had sent that money to me, so I thought, I didn't really think about it, but you would have expected that the loss was something that they were able to consume. So on the 23rd of February 1995, when I left Singapore, the plan was to go to Phuket and meet up with somebody who worked on the trading floor, just to try and work out how bad everything was. But all of the flights to Phuket had gone in the morning. So the only place we could get to that afternoon was a place called Kota Kinabalu, which is the Malayan side of Borneo. So that's where we flew to. We stayed in the Shangri-La, just trying to work out quite how bad the situation was. Went down into the local newsagent in the hotel we were staying in and picked up the Asian Wall Street Journal, and the headline is British Bank Collapses. So that kind of hits you full in the face and you realise quite how bad it is. You know, that's starting to build. Trying to pretend to be normal at the same time, which is difficult. Obviously my wife is more aware of what's going on now than she was, but you still don't really want to talk about it too much. So do you go to Australia and New Zealand, or do you go right and try and get back to Europe? So after a day or so, we had to change hotel because the hotel that we were in was very touristy. Obviously the story is everywhere on the TVs and in the newspapers, so you're a bit worried about being caught there. So we go into a more local hotel down in downtown, but we're trying to work out where we can get back to. And the only flight that's going out anytime soon leaves from Kota Kinabalu, goes to Brunei. Brunei it goes to Thailand, from Thailand it goes to Abu Dhabi, and then from Abu Dhabi it goes to Frankfurt. No reason or rationale for flying to Frankfurt, it was the first European destination and obviously was closer to the UK. Didn't really expect to get through passport control in Malaysia. Expected to be stopped and detained there, but somehow we managed to get through passport control. We had to wait for 8 or 9 hours in Brunei, then sort of made our way to the boarding gate, and above the boarding gate there's a TV, and you know, this is the only story that's on repeat throughout the whole period. So you're trying to get on the flight without anybody recognising you, which we just about managed to do. You sit down and they're giving out newspapers as they used to do in the day, and your picture is on the front page of all of the newspapers. So you sat there as well, and you're trying to put blankets over your face and silly sort of stuff. And what was happening at the same time is the travel agent obviously had recognised me and had reported that she'd sold a ticket to us, and she'd reported that to somebody, and then eventually it got to Interpol. So now Interpol are looking for us. When I arrived in Frankfurt, however many hours it took to get there, the police came and arrested me off of the plane. To suggest that there was a massive sense of relief would just be a lie. You know, you're just facing the next hurdle. Part of that was getting my wife sent back to the UK. The original charges said that we were travelling on false passports, which we weren't. The charge was removed for my wife at the time. You're being moved to a different prison in Höchst in Frankfurt. You know, you're kept on 24-hour lockdown for a week, which is tough. And you're going through that very, you know, emotional process of losing your freedom, and it's tough to deal with. It was a time of the Balkan states were all breaking down, so there was a lot of gun runners, there was a lot of people from Yugoslavia. So it was it was a dangerous place, and it's your first time in that sort of population, and you've got to traverse it and work your way through it. You're going through this constant turmoil about what your sentence is going to be. The speculation in the English media is that it could be up to 84 years. We speak to the Serious Fraud Office. You know, we threatened to go to the European Court of Justice but they're all just delaying tactics until we're eventually willing and able to explore some sort of deal with the Singaporean authorities. And we're not negotiating with the Singaporeans. They arrive in Germany, they want to take me back immediately. They offer a maximum of 8 years in prison. You know, specimen charges, and there were certain other conditions. I have to pay a certain amount of money to the Singaporean police, I have to make a formal apology to the people of Singapore. Yeah, we agreed to the deal, which would be 5 years, 4 months in prison. And, you know, Germany was tough, dangerous, but Singapore was tougher, probably less dangerous, but a much tougher regime. In Singapore, the prison was Tanah Merah, so it was maximum security. Everything is very regimental. It's modelled off some sort of military regime. You have to squat down when you see an officer and say good morning, sir, and things like that. I'm sure you don't see them in too many English prisons, to be honest with you. But yeah, it's tough. Everybody's a triad gang member. I was the only exception. Other English inmates who might have had a drug offence or something, they had to choose sides in terms of who they wanted to support. And the boredom is unbelievable. You're locked up for 23 hours a day, so your daily regime would be somebody waking you at 6 o'clock in the morning, giving you your breakfast to the cell, so it would be 3 pieces of bread and a cup of tea or a cup of coffee. At lunchtime, you'd go out into the yard for an hour, so I used to run for the hour. Then you'd go back to the cell, do a little bit more exercise. Food would be delivered about 12. So it'd either be chicken, a fish, which was quite small and had lots of bones and the head on it still, so I wasn't too keen on that, or mutton, you know, some fairly old, pretty rank sort of lamb. And rice, which you're not used to eating 3 times a day, so you have to kind of get used to that. And then your dinner would arrive at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And then lights out about 8 o'clock at night. And there's nothing in the cell. They're pristine white. You sleep on the floor. There's enough room for 3 of you. And there's a hole in one corner where you go to the toilet, and there's a small barrier that kind of dissects that a little bit. If there was one advantage of Singapore, because there is so much control over what goes on, it's fairly safe. You know, there is violence, and the violence is really quick, it's really brutal, but you can avoid it. When something does happen, and there would be gang clashes, so you'd get a gang clash every now and again, and there would be weapons that would be used that they'd either brought back from workshops or they'd made themselves somehow from a toothbrush. The guards would come in, commando guards with full battle gear on, with big sticks, and they would start hitting people over the head unless you were on the floor holding your head in your hands. So it was brutally put down, but it maintained a degree of safety within the prison. So I never really had any issues. You know, I had one sort of disturbance with one of the main people in my wing on one occasion, but I used to kickbox when I worked in the city. So, you know, I was able to sort of survive the 30 seconds or so that was required in that. You know, I used to get a lot of letters. So you would get the letters Monday to Friday, not the weekends. So on a Monday, you'd start, the thought process would be that you've got a 1 in 5 chance of getting a letter that day. And then if it doesn't arrive, you know, the next day it's 1 in 4, so it's an improvement. So as long as you can reframe the way that you're thinking about different things and break it down into smaller periods. So visits were few and far between, but you could look forward to those. So it's all about reframing how you think about things in order to survive. But yeah, it's tough. Whilst I was in prison in Singapore, they used to regularly change my cellmates because they didn't want them getting too friendly with me, maybe. So they would change my cellmates on a fairly regular basis. And on one time, I'd had a couple of Malay inmates that were getting on quite well. They were from different gangs, but they shared a religion, so they would pray and do that sort of stuff. And there was no reason to change them. But the guards turned up and they said, "Oh, we've got to." They bring you out of the cell, empty the cell completely. There's nothing in the cell anyway. It's not a great deal to empty. And they brought us all out, and then they said they were changing my cellmates. And I said, it's ridiculous, right? So I said, look, I'm not going back in the cell then. And so they decided that for my disobedience that they'd send me to the punishment cells. So I stayed in the punishment cells for about 31 days. The door never opens. The daylight is blocked out. They turn the lights off during the day and they turn them on at night. So there's a bit of sensory deprivation. But your food is given through a cat flap in the door. So it's a lot tougher, and you know, there's nothing in the cell. So you literally can walk up and down, that's it. And you work out that if you walk up and down 750 or 755 times, that's an hour. and that's how you pass the time for 31 days. So I went back down to the general area, and then about an hour or so later I was called for a visit, and it was the British vice consul who was there. So she said that, you know, I'd lost a bit of weight, didn't look particularly well, my eyes were bloodshot, obviously I'd been in the punishment cells, and, you know, starting to get a bit of pain in my stomach, so I went to see the doctor in the prison. He then took some blood tests, my red cell blood count was low, so he gave me some iron tablets, and that was it. So I'd go back and the iron tablets would arrive every day, you'd take those. The pain's not getting any better. They took me to a hospital close by. I was in A&E, and the doctor who came down found the lump straight away. So he said, I'm going to need to send you to the ward upstairs. The guards have got guns, there's big double doors, and you're chained to the bed. So it's a little bit over the top. One day when I was there, you know, they'd done a couple of investigations. By this stage, they decided that it's cancer. And they told my lawyer, and they found me curled around the bowl in the toilet bowl, just because the tumour had got so big that it pushed onto my lung and collapsed my lung, so that I was incapacitated in the toilet. So they took me down for an emergency operation. They removed the tumour that was 10 centimetres by 7 centimetres, and then you know, I had 38 staples in my stomach, and then after a couple of days, they took me back to the prison. And then they said that they wanted to give me chemotherapy inside the prison, but, you know, I refused the chemotherapy on the basis that I wasn't going to let them leg cuff me to the bed, to which they were all aghast. They were showing me the rules and regulations that you have to go, but then eventually they made a decision that I could go and just be like a day patient, and go and get the chemo for 5 days, or 5 continuous days, and then it would be 3 weeks off. So I did that for 6 months, and then, you know, that would have been August of 1998, and then I was released in July of 1999. I wasn't released early or anything. Everybody gets a standard 1/3 remission, so I would have been released in accordance with those rules. After I fled Singapore on the 23rd of February, the sort of chronology from that sort of point would have been the 24th. Everybody would have been aware that the bank was insolvent, couldn't trade anymore, and they were running around trying to do their best to rescue it. That would have continued over the weekend, 25th and 26th of February, with the Bank of England. And on the Monday, which is the 27th of February, the bank was ultimately sold for £1 to ING. I think the Barings name is still out there in the US. I think it's the fund management side of it. Barings Asset Management was never taken over by ING, so Barings Asset Management has always been around since the collapse of the bank. They didn't offer me my job back. As to the question of whether no bank is too big to fail, I mean, it's a difficult one. I think banks are an important part of the infrastructure of many countries, and there probably are one or two that are too big to fail because they're involved in so many different transactions at so many levels. I mean, I think Lehman's is probably the obvious example. What ensued after the collapse of Lehman's was a global financial collapse because there was fear, there was panic, and Lehman's were involved in so many different transactions at different levels. With Barings, it was one country, it was all in Singapore, it was all in one product, which was the Nikkei 225, so it was easy to contain. And what you find now is that a lot of trading is done within the hedge fund industry. Yeah, nobody else went to prison. There were a few of the directors that were banned from holding other directorships for a period of time. You know, I'm often asked if I think that's just. Yeah, probably. You know, they didn't do anything criminal. Their only thing that they're guilty of is, you know, a fairly high level of stupidity to allow it to happen. You know, they've got to look at themselves in the mirror. I think that's the most damning thing that they have to do in relation to to their involvement in the collapse of Barings. But you know, I'm front and centre, fully responsible, totally accountable for everything that happened. So I was released from Singapore in 1999. I signed an injunction for £100 million whilst I was at Heathrow Airport from the liquidators, and then was spirited away in a car. And then slowly from there, you know, you kind of have to get back into life. And, you know, being in prison for 4.5 years, you're not quite institutionalized, but you're not used to making decisions, you know, on a very basic basis. I wasn't used to wearing shoes because, you know, you walk around barefoot in Singapore for nearly 4 years whilst you're in prison. So it took some reacclimatization. Everybody was going to work on a Monday, and I was kind of left there feeling a bit empty. So it was important that I put some structure back in my life. So I did a psychology degree for 3 years in Middlesex, and then met somebody, remarried and moved to Ireland. In those first months and years, the liquidators were paying me a monthly stipend to continue to help them, but also that was based on me needing more medical advice as I was continuing my recovery from cancer. So, you know, I used to say to the liquidators, if I go and get a job, what do you want? And they said, well, we want half of what you're earning. And that was, you know, regardless of where the job was. I mean, I did TV interviews. There was one in Holland that went to the liquidators. Obviously, I'd serialised my return in the Daily Mail. That went to the liquidators. And then given the opportunity to do some after dinner speaking, I always used to be quite introvert, was a million miles away from being extrovert, so wasn't used to that sort of environment. But, you know, I've been doing it for 26 years now, so I've got quite good at it. And I talk at keynote conferences as well and give addresses there talking about risk management, compliance and the importance of corporate governance. I do a bit of corporate intelligence work these days. That's kind of, it's moved slightly to the side of that as well, that we look at some scams that people have got involved in where they've lost money, and we try to repatriate those funds. We have a number of cases with the Financial Ombudsman at the moment. I wrote the book Rogue Trader whilst I was in prison in Germany. I had nothing to do with the movie. So David Frost made the movie. He obviously recruited Ewan McGregor to take my role within the movie. The movie is taken from the book, so it's accurate. You know, people driving around in Porsches in Singapore, it didn't happen. You know, me driving a beaten up old car going to the airport, it didn't happen. But, you know, that's the way movies get made, I suppose. So. I don't think any bank is really too much at risk from people going rogue these days. The controls are so much better. The quality of people in those roles is so much more superior than it ever has been. You've got, you know, real-time data that is helping the situation as well. The problem is that you still have very niche areas that aren't getting the amount of surveillance and scrutiny that they should. So if you look at the more recent cases of financial scandal, you know, there's one at Macquarie Bank, which was during the COVID period. Absolutely astonished that that happened, but still, you know, it didn't get to a bit more than 30 million, right? Still a big number, but there were a set of unique circumstances around COVID and working from home. You've got some family firms, Bill Huang, and the losses at Archegos Capital. Part of the family firms wasn't really an area that had ever been looked at. So it's been looked at, and, you know, the single stock exposure that he had was huge. Again, the lack of oversight and the lack of communication between the banks and sharing information, I think was quite shocking during that one. You've got FTX, which is in the crypto space where they're trying to avoid all sorts of regulation. Very, you know, systemic breakdown, kind of like Barings. You know, the auditors weren't doing their job again. You know, the regulators, if there was any during that period, weren't. And he was, You know, he was obviously going out and supporting political parties in the US and giving out lots of gifts during that sort of period as well. And everybody was believing the story, yet behind it was just a house of cards. I think it's very difficult to suggest or predict where the next big issue is going to come for the financial markets. There's a lot of spread betting and CFD firms that have been growing over the years. I don't think it's regulated as tough as maybe it should be. There's some unsavoury stuff that goes on in that area between different books that are traded. The banks have it right probably at the moment. You know, they've got the right number of people working in compliance, the right number of people working in risk management, and there's an awful lot of oversight and control of everything that goes on. I think the worry from a mainstream financial marketplace is possibly deregulation and what deregulation looks like. You know, it was during a period of deregulation that, you know, I popped up to the forefront of everything that was going on. But you know, you would think that it's going to be better managed than it was in the past, but if the government are managing it, you know, maybe not. I think the industry over the last 25 years or so, it's like an elastic band. The degree of regulation, the degree of control has just increased significantly, and that takes people away from the real challenges that they should be doing on a daily basis. I'm not convinced that AI is the answer to that. I think technology has a huge part to play in everything that goes on in the world of finance, but you know, delivering up more false positives is not going to be advantageous to the industry. I think it's already an issue where they're dealing, you know, a lot of people are dealing with those things. The controls need to be continually improved. I think crypto is an area that could be improved upon. I know they are resistant to regulation and to change, but I think there are so many episodes in the world of banking where there has been poor oversight, poor controls and scandal that I think they can learn, and I think therefore they should be more willing to learn. You know, one of the simplest pieces of advice I give to anybody in any situation, right, it doesn't matter whether it's finance, health or anything else that's going on in your life, you know, I think communication is the most important thing you can do at any stage. So, you know, I always encourage, certainly my children, to ask for help and advice, right? It's the one thing I didn't do. And if I had, I would have been surrounded by people that would have helped me and pointed me in the right direction. Whereas I, at 25 years old, saw asking for help and advice as a sign of weakness. It was more the culture around 1990s banking. But if I'd seen it as a sign of trying to do things correctly, you know, things would have been very different. And, you know, I might still be working in a bank now. You know, the one thing that rings true for me loud and clear is that, you know, it's easy to get another job. It's not easy to get another reputation. So, you know, it's important that you always do the right thing.
Hi, I'm a producer on How Crime Works. If you enjoyed this video, then please subscribe and comment below with more ideas of topics you'd like us to cover in this series.